Hi everyone, welcome to Module 4. In this module, we'll be talking a little bit about kind of just an introduction to natural hazards and risk, but also look at the idea of overpopulation as sort of something that is a kind of can bring about apocalypse in and of itself, just having too many people and all the consequences of too many people. So in this section, we really start kind of moving out of some of the stuff around cultural studies and looking at different, religious perceptions of apocalypse and start getting more into the science part of the course, where we'll talk a little bit about how do you measure and assess risk, and also in the coming sections we'll really get into looking at particular kinds of hazards that are known to be kind of genuine hazards, such as large earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanoes, these sort of processes. So that's kind of where we're heading. But today, again, just kind of looking more at risk assessment and visions of overpopulation, and a little background on natural hazards in general. All right. So well, I guess the place to start with in terms of natural hazards is that the Earth is a dynamic place, right? There are all sorts of different types of processes, geologic, climatological, things that are going on that are always shifting and changing. And so, for instance, like in 2008, 2018, here we are, not 2008, 10 years ago, but in 2018, right, one of the big stories that's been going on is a lot of the major volcanic eruptions on the island of Hawaii that have been, devastating houses and all of that. But really, of course, this is a volcano that's been going off pretty much consistently since 1983, and also has been fairly active for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. And so it's not really necessarily surprising. It's just that people have kind of put their houses in front of some of these processes. And so when we look at natural hazards, we kind of have to look at the physical science side of what's causing these dynamic Earth processes, but we also have to look at why it becomes a hazard only really when humans interact with that environment in particular ways, and so, but ways in which can be quite catastrophic. So a few things in terms of talking about natural hazards is that one of the thing about natural hazards is that they're usually typically fairly predictable. You can look back at the record of different events in a particular place, and things like we know for the most part where large earthquakes are going to occur. We may not know exactly when, but we know where. We know where the active volcanoes are, these sort of things. We know where tsunamis happen relatively frequently. And so because of that, there's a way of kind of applying scientific valuation or evaluations to those threats. Second main concept we're going to look at today is risk analysis is a very important component in understanding the effects of hazardous processes, because these large events tend to have certain probabilities of happening. There are ways of kind of looking at what are the risks of particular types of human settlement patterns or processes or that sort of thing in these areas. But one of the other key points to bring up is that hazardous events that previously produced disasters are now producing catastrophes. And I'll talk about kind of the distinction between disasters and catastrophes here in a second. But in other words, the consequences of these natural hazardous events has become kind of, they've been more devastating than they used to be. And we'll talk a little about why. So a few definitions here to throw out. One of them is just hazard. And hazard is a natural process or event that is a potential threat to human life or property, right? So when I talk about different types of hazards, whether they be natural or human caused, that's what kind of I'm referring to. A disaster, actually, according to kind of people who keep the data on these sort of things, has a fairly specific criteria. It's a hazardous event that occurs in a limited particular time frame when we talk about a disaster, and in a defined area. And so it actually has criteria for what actually gets labeled as a disaster when we're kind of trying to figure out how many disasters happen on the Earth in a certain time. So for instance, the criteria is that at least 10 people are killed, or 100 or more people are just affected, that some sort of state of emergency is declared, or that international assistance is requested. And so there's these different criteria kind of to kick in to kind of consider something a disaster. A catastrophe is basically a really, really big disaster. It's a massive disaster that requires significant amounts of money or time to recover. So the question is why has there been an increase in disasters and catastrophes? Because there certainly has been. And One of the main reasons is that there are just more people in the world. If we look at the world's population, it's more than tripled in the past 70 years. So kind of simply put, there are more people in the way of these natural dynamic processes. And so population tends to grow exponentially, meaning that, you know, 2 people make 4 people, which make 8 people, which makes 16, which make 32, which makes 64, and then makes 128, right? It kind of goes up like that. And that's one of the reasons why we have this kind of rapidly growing population on the Earth. And by doing so, it increases exposure to hazards. It also creates more pollution. You also have effects such as, like, you know, climate change and things like that from more and more people using more resources. And so this is just a graph kind of showing you, you know, since 1830, the number of people in the world, and it's kind of a little bit tough to see this graph, but basically if you look at the width of it, that's kind of like what the human population is, and it looks at different parts of the world and what their percentage of population is and which areas are really growing. So part of it is just that there are more people in the way of natural occurring repeating dynamic Earth processes, so therefore more people are going to get killed by them, right? So for instance, we know that every, you know, 100 or so years is going to be a major earthquake in California somewhere. Well, now there's 60 million people living in California, so when the next one hits, there's going to be a lot. It's going to be a much bigger catastrophe than it was in 1906 when one hit, and it's going to be a much bigger catastrophe than when they may have hit back in the, you know, 15 or 1600s when there wasn't nearly as many people living in those areas. But it's more than just about population. It's also about things like land use. Where are people allowed to live? Are people living in floodplains? Are they living in places where the volcanoes can erupt? This sort of stuff. So it's not just too many people. It's kind of where those people are. They're being pushed kind of into more and more risky locations. And there's a great phrase when people talk about, like, kind of earthquake damage, where people say that earthquakes don't kill people, buildings kill people, right? Which is this idea that, yes, the same size earthquake can have very, very different effects depending on, like, how good the building materials are, of where people live, and a host of other sort of things. And one of the videos that we're going to watch here in this course, you know, called The Quake, gets into the earthquake in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, that happened in 2010, which was not a very large earthquake geologically. It was a 7.0, but it killed thousands and thousands of people, partially because of it was right under Port-au-Prince, partially because of the geologic structure, but a lot of it just had to do with how shoddy the construction was in Port-au-Prince, and also how ill-equipped the country was to sort of handle that disaster politically, economically, in terms of their infrastructure and all those things. And so because of that, you get people pushed, you know, into more and more vulnerable places, as I mentioned, because of just this larger population. And also one of the things, too, is that one of the reasons why disasters tend to be much larger these days is it has to do with the fact that you spend a lot of capital and infrastructure in particular places. So think about a place like, say, New York City or Los Angeles or these sort of places. There's so much money and human labor has gone into making the skyscrapers and the freeway systems and all these kinds of things, such that now when say a major earthquake or a tsunami or these kind of events happen, the amount of loss economically is now much, much higher than it used to be, because so much stuff has been kind of put in place, and those places are sometimes, you know, prone to disaster. New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina would be a great example of this. And then, of course, you also have some things going on with environmental change. One of the things that people bring up all the time whenever there's, like, more hurricanes or this or that is the ways in which this might potentially tie into climate change, which we'll talk about a little more a couple lectures down the road. And so one of the things that you'll see, you know, this map here is basically, you know, it's in the readings, I believe, and it just talks about the different kinds of hazards you find in different areas, right? Some places are more prone to volcanoes, some places are more prone to earthquake hazard, some places get floods, some places get hurricanes, and all of that. And so the different kind of threat that you might get differs by where you are. Where we are here in the Northeast, we don't have a whole lot. Looks like we have some landslides, and what's not on here is like ice storms or that kind of stuff, which can sometimes you know, cause a lot of damage. But if we look at the trend line here, and I know this cuts off about 10 years ago, but if you see the trend from 1987 to 2006, you can see this is the number of natural disasters, and it's gone from being about 200 per year to more than doubling now. And a lot of the reason, again, for that is just these different things in terms of people living in riskier spaces and there being more people. It's not necessarily that the Earth has gotten angrier, per se. So, of course, the different effects of hazards, and this is in the reading, and we're going to get into this more in the coming modules, the effects of hazards are different. And different ones have a greater impact on human life. Some have more of an effect on property. And so hazards vary greatly in their ability to cause like large catastrophes. And so this is in the reading. And it looks at like the deaths per year from particular kinds of events. Typically, this is kind of in just in the United States, but worldwide, typically floods are considered actually one of the most deadly of all natural hazards. Whereas you can see things like volcanoes typically don't actually kill very many people. Like some of the stuff in 2018 that's going on with volcanoes on the Big Island of Hawaii, there's been no deaths because people have some warning as to when the eruptions are happening, and they can kind of get out of the way and evacuate, and the lava doesn't move terribly quickly. Whereas floods actually sometimes happen more quickly with flash floods and that sort of thing and kill many more people. Landslides, same sort of thing. Tornadoes, lightning, these kinds of things. Heat waves also kill large numbers of people. And as you can see, nobody has died from extraterrestrial impact very much. That's pretty rare. All right. But one of the key things to look at too with hazards and stuff is about who dies and who doesn't. Right? The same disaster affects people very, very differently. So you get this idea of what are sometimes called spaces of vulnerability. Basically, this idea that some people, even within the same town, may be much more vulnerable to a disaster. A great example of this would be during the Indian Ocean tsunami. I believe that was 2004, if I remember correctly. But one of the things that happened is that there was a lot, almost 3 women died for every 2 men that died during that disaster. And the question was sort of why was this disaster kind of killing women much more than men? And a lot of it had to do with the fact that women were in much more vulnerable spaces and in much more vulnerable conditions when these disasters hit. Because for one thing, oftentimes the women were the ones that were in charge of, had the children that they were trying to protect. And that slowed them down from getting away from the rising waters. Also, in many places that the tsunami hit, women and girls were not taught how to swim, whereas men were, and that also made a difference. And also in some of the areas that were fishing areas that were hit, the men were at sea, which when a tsunami comes and you're at sea, that actually is a much safer place because the tsunami wave goes underneath you, whereas when you're on land, it kills many more people. So that's just one example, or New Orleans in the United States during Hurricane Katrina is another example where a lot of the African American neighborhoods were the ones that were at a lower elevation and much more prone to flooding when the levees broke than some of the more white and affluent neighborhoods. And so even within a city and in different areas, or by gender, these sort of things, different people are exposed to hazards differently. Now, there are a couple, there's a couple different kind of perspectives on this to bring up. One is like when we're looking at natural disasters, there's what's sometimes referred to as the physicalist orientation. And what this means is that there's a kind of branch of science dealing with natural hazards that really looks at the hazards as being very much just physical processes. Natural forces cause these natural disasters, and so to stop them you have to manage the physical processes. Like if you're getting flooding, well then you have to build better levees. If you're having a lot of earthquakes in an area, then you have to engineer your buildings better, that kind of stuff. And this is most of the kind of traditional science on disaster. However, more recently you get the perspectives like I was just talking about with spaces of vulnerability, which sometimes is referred to as denaturalizing disasters. And they put these things in quote where they say, these aren't really natural disasters per se. Like the process that started it might be natural, but the fact that it's a disaster is usually a social and political or economic kind of consequence of some people being more vulnerable than others. And so it kind of poses the question, to what extent do natural forces really cause the disaster itself? The disaster being that human societies are not arranged correctly for those dynamic earth processes. And the argument here is that you need to integrate both the physical and human dimensions to try and understand why disasters happen. And again, that's kind of more the perspective I take in this class, is that you have to kind of look at both the physical processes, but also the way humans are kind of responding or dealing with those processes. Okay. So the next point I want to make is just talking a little bit about risk, because during this whole class, that's going to come up a lot. Like, what are the risks of particular kinds of disasters? And so when we talk about risk, there's a few things that we have to think about here. Risk is not just the probability of something. It's about the probability of something happening and the consequences of it happening. Like, what's going to be the damage, etc. And so there's this idea of acceptable risk. What is the amount of risk that an individual or a society is willing to take? For instance, with flooding, typically in the United States, we say that people can't build, or they have to have flood insurance if they live in areas that are what we call 100-year floodplains. And what that basically means is that that this is an area that people shouldn't build in places where there's basically a 1% chance of that area flooding each year. That there's going to be a flood big enough every 100 years to flood that area. But now, if you're in a place where it's deemed is going to get that kind of a large flood, say only every 112 years or 110 years or something like that, we'll say, yeah, you can build there. We say that that's an acceptable risk. It's like, yes, every year you have a slightly less than 1% chance of having your home flooded, but we'll say, it's acceptable because if we, if we said you couldn't build in all the land up to that would ever potentially flood, then you would lose the ability to use all of that land and all of that. And so typically we come up with some kind of measure of what we consider acceptable. We don't always necessarily agree on what is an acceptable risk, and to some people certain risks are different than others. Like, having taught in Hawaii for a long time on the island with all the volcanoes, there are plenty of people that thought I was, or that me and my family were like, well, why are you going there? Isn't it really risky? You have these volcanoes, you have these tsunamis, you have all of this kind of stuff. But people who live there just kind of like, that's considered just an acceptable risk, and we don't really even think about it much. So when we talk about probability, oftentimes we will talk about ratios. It's a mathematical statement about how likely something is that will happen. So for instance, you get these sort of things about the approximate risk of death of certain things like smoking, driving a car, like this, eating an 8-ounce meal per week of Great Lakes salmon with 1984 contaminant levels. I don't know why we need that, but anyway, that's on one of the that's just one of the things that they kind of show in terms of risk, in terms of, I think that's mercury contamination right there, and all these kinds of stuff. But the probability is just one aspect of it. The other is sort of, again, the consequences. And this is what sometimes in risk analysis is referred to as also dread. Like, how much do we kind of dread the potential consequences of a particular disaster? So for instance, there are certain things that have very high probability of happening, but the consequences are low. We don't really care about it. Like, for instance, what is the probability of stubbing my toe if I'm wearing flip-flops? Well, it's pretty high. The consequences, not so high, so I don't care all that much, even though it's highly probable. What is the probability of an asteroid destroying the planet? It's actually a very, very low probability, but the consequences are really high, so sometimes people get worried about these kinds of things. But then you have all these things sort of in between. So for instance, like smog or air pollution in certain cities, you actually have a very high probability of encountering this every day, and the consequences are sort of moderate. And so a lot of these times we're trying to figure out, well, how risky is a certain thing? Or like, for instance, nuclear power. We talked a little bit, or we'll talk a little bit about like nuclear catastrophes here later in the course. The probability of an actual nuclear accident is relatively small. However, the consequences of that are relatively large when it occurs in places like Fukushima or in Chernobyl and other kinds of areas where nuclear material has been leaked, or nuclear weapons testing in the past, and this kind of stuff. And so this is just a little, right, like saying that, yeah, nuclear energy, the cleanest energy there is, except every once in a while, right? All right. So when we think about the things that most people are afraid of, and when we think about this in the context of this class around apocalypse, right, people tend to be very afraid of these very spectacular kind of low probability but high impact sort of events, right? So if we look at your odds of dying of certain things, your odds of dying in a catastrophic asteroid strike are actually quite low, as is being poisoned with anthrax or bubonic plague or dying from venomous insects and lizards, etc. These things are hijacking, right? Being executed by U.S. civil authorities, all of that. Okay, lightning strike. You can see how unlikely some of these big things are that people worry about all the time, like hijacking or airplane crash or all this, or actually flesh-eating bacteria, etc. Whereas if you look at the things that you actually have a pretty strong chance of dying of, heart disease, cancer, stroke, respiratory disease, injuries, diabetes, I like this one, bad medical care. You're more likely to be killed by bad medical care than a gunshot. Oh, no, excuse me. More likely to be killed by a gunshot than bad medical care, but worse, have better chance of being killed by bad medical care than you do any kind of airplane crash. So fly all you like, don't go to the doctor. I think that's I like this. Odds you'll injure yourself playing golf, etc. Odds you'll have triplets without using fertility drugs. All right. So anyway, this gives you this idea of, of what it is that's actually likely versus what we tend to worry about, and this is important when we talk about apocalypse. But of course, in the end, your odds of dying of something, 100%. All right. So the question is, how do we know what the risks are? And this is actually sometimes, we can do studies and look at the percentages like we just kind of looked at there, of these different odds of dying of like diabetes, this and that. But the question is that when we're trying to figure out what risks are, there are two major perspectives that you need to know in terms of understanding how we think about risk. The first one is what's called the realist perspective. This is a very kind of like mathematical, just looks at the actual numbers of what are the probabilities of certain events and that sort of thing. So a realist perspective assumes that risk is sort of this tangible byproduct of actually occurring natural and social processes. It can be mapped, measured. Knowledgeable experts will kind of know what's going on, and you can control this to some degree. Like, in other words, we can know what the risks of something are, or what the risks of something is. But then there's a flip side of this, which is called the constructivist side. This emphasizes that risks do not directly reflect natural reality, but are refracted in every society through lenses shaped by history, politics, and culture. According to the constructivist perspective, scientific studies may be conducted to determine the potential hazards of like a location or an event, but the findings of these studies are often only one voice in the chorus of narratives. So what this means is that basically we know the risks differently, or that we think about the risks differently. In other words, we may know what the probability is of something, but that doesn't necessarily attach to what we dread, what we feel the negative consequences of something could be. So for instance, if we are close to a nuclear plant, somebody that's a realist could say, well, look, the chances of a nuclear plant having a meltdown and a contamination leakage, having contamination leak out of the containment vessel is very small. But somebody coming from the constructivist side may say, well, that may be, but I'm really afraid of the consequences, and I've also seen what's happened in places like Fukushima and in Chernobyl and these other areas, and so I don't necessarily trust that. And now you could say, some people that come from the realist perspective say that the person that's being worried about this is being sort of not being rational, but the fact is that you have to take into account what these people are thinking, because when it comes down to making policies, or let's say how it's going to affect the value of houses in a neighborhood or other economic processes, you have to consider what people think, whether it's accurate or not. So for instance, if they build a nuclear plant next to a fancy neighborhood, you can say all you like about how little the probability is of any kind of accident, but the fact is that the property values will go down because people are scared to live next to that place. And so this idea of how we kind of construct risk mentally does have these very real effects, even if it may not be considered technically accurate. Right? So there's this idea that people often overestimate the frequency and seriousness of sensational causes of death, and underestimate the risks from familiar causes that claim lives one by one. In other words, we think things like plane crashes and disease epidemics and asteroid strikes and all this kind of stuff are more frequent than they really are. And the other thing too is that in general the public will perceive involuntary risks as greater than voluntary risks. So in other words, I drive a car fairly frequently, and I don't think of that as being very risky, even though the odds of getting into an accident are relatively high. Whereas when I'm on an airplane and I'm just sitting there and I'm a passenger, I don't have any choice. I don't have any control over the airplane. I've seen all these videos of airplane crashes and all of this. I get much, much more concerned on an airplane than I do in a car, even though the probabilities of dying on an airplane versus car are, it's much safer on a plane than a car. But when it's kind of considered to be sort of the risk is what I can control and what I'm used to versus what I'm not. We tend to kind of have that difference in perception of risk. Okay, so now just a couple things here, talking about perspectives on population. So that kind of wraps up the kind of risk assessment section of the module. But there are two reasons to look at population. First of all, as mentioned, population growth makes catastrophes and more likely and more hazardous events. But there's also the idea that overpopulation could be a cause of apocalypse, right? That kind of the fact that we have so many people on the earth and that they're consuming so many resources or creating so much pollution, in and of itself could basically create the conditions that cause the extinction of mankind. All right, so one of the reasons why we look at kind of population here in geography courses is that it's sort of, we're not just looking at the numbers of people, we also want to know kind of where they are. How are they spread out? Are they moving from one place to another? And we also like to look at things like the density of population per square unit of land. And one of the things is that, that's another kind of concern with population is that it also connects to lifestyle and culture and the way people live. So it's not the same, like having a certain number of people on the planet, say 7 billion versus 10 billion versus 1 billion, it's not just the sheer number of people that has an effect, it's also how they live. So for instance, if they're all kind of living an affluent lifestyle and they're all using a lot of resources and eating a lot of meat that that is made from fairly inefficient processes of taking grain and feeding it to livestock and all that, that uses much more in terms of resources than say than 10 billion people that are living in a much more simple way and maybe not and have less processed foods and that kind of stuff. And so it's not just the number of people, it's also how they're living. So we have to kind of keep that in mind. So when we look at the kind of distribution of the world's population, this is important because if we're trying to understand why disasters seem to be more prevalent in some places than others, a lot of that has to do with just where the people are. And people are very unevenly distributed around the world. And so when we look, I'll look here at some maps of population density in a minute, but just to kind of give you an idea of where people are, about 20% of all humans reside in China, about 17% in India. And in the United States here, we have only about 4.5% of the world's population is here in the US. And so one kind of fact that some people don't necessarily realize is that, if you look at this area of East Asia here, this is where all the people are for the most part. So there are actually more people that live inside this area right here than there are people that live outside of that area. And so you can see that kind of this is showing population density, like how many people there are per square mile. And you can see that the major population density centers are here in Central Europe, but also India and China. And out here where we are in the US, you can see it's, we have our dense little areas here along the eastern seaboard and Chicago area and that kind of thing. But for the most part, we're nothing like the population densities you get in like Europe or these parts of East Asia. So one of the things that comes up when we talk about, how many people could the Earth potentially support, or can a particular area support before it becomes in and of itself a catastrophe or a potential apocalypse, is this concept of carrying capacity. And this is something that's borrowed from biology, which basically is just the maximum number of organisms that we think can be supported in a given area. And this is more meaningful than just density, because yes, some places have high population density, but that's because those are fairly rich agricultural landscapes that can support large numbers of people. The kinds of population densities you get, say, in India or Eastern China, you couldn't do those kinds of population densities in Alaska or in the middle of the Sahara Desert, right? Because the carrying capacity of those landscapes is not as high as other areas. And so one of the things that kind of where population can become a problem is that you have this idea of carrying capacity, like how many organisms a place can hold. But then you also have what's called biotic potential, and that is, biotic potential has to do with how many offspring can a species have over the course of its lifetime. For humans, our maximum biotic potential is probably about 20, right? I mean, that'd be really pushing it, but like if people had like 20 kids, it's possible over a lifetime, maybe even to do a few more, but that's about the limit. And so the thing is that every species on Earth has the ability to produce more offspring than there are kind of parents, essentially, in the generation. Any species that was producing fewer members every generation would become extinct and die off fairly quickly, right? And so one of the things is that humans are no exception. We can create more of us than there are numbers of us at any given time. And because of that, what typically happens with other organisms is that organisms tend to produce more than the environment can support, and then the environment comes in and sort of essentially puts in the limits and kills off some of these extra members of the species. Like, so for instance, this is using fish as an example. You have 2 fish, they make 4 fish, they're making more fish, and they have the ability to just grow exponentially. But what keeps the population down is all these environmental factors, like you don't have enough oxygen in the water, there's not enough food, disease starts going through these dense populations, predators start picking them off, there's not enough space, these sort of things start to really affect that population. One of the things about human population is that we have managed through technology and agriculture, and also our ability to kind of move things, move products and foods around the world, we've managed to release a lot of these environmental pressures, which has allowed our population in the last 150 years to really skyrocket, because our death rates have essentially gone down and our birth rates have not, as a species over the whole Earth, really dropped to kind of accommodate that. And so one of the things about humans is that when we talk about carrying capacity, it's a little different, because other animals, they may move around and migrate and go to different pastures and things like that, but they don't have the ability to go and get food from all around the world and bring it to one particular place, or to come up with these large distribution systems, or to engage in agricultural production. And because of that, we don't have quite the same pressures that other species do. But the question remains, do we, on a global level, is there a carrying capacity for the whole Earth, which we may kind of go beyond? Well, right, there's these ways in which human populations are different. All right. But one thing I want to show, I'm actually going to show the diagram here first, because I think it's more illustrative. This shows what the human population has been doing. If you look at, from 10,000 BC up here, we didn't have, this is when we get like 250 million people on the planet here around year 1. And really, you get to about 1800, and we're still like, less than 500 million. And then all of a sudden, our population just skyrockets, right? Where we have 1 billion people in 1800 to now we have 7, getting close to 8 billion people. And you can see that the kind of adding the next billion kept taking shorter and shorter time. It took 130 years to get our second billion. Only took us 30 years to get our next billion. It took us 15 years to get our following billion. 12 years after that. But then you can see it's starting to lengthen out a little bit. 13 years to get our next billion, etc. And so the world population is definitely kind of running away. So there's 3 perspectives that I want to talk about here that kind of discuss whether or not this human population growth is a problem. And the first one I want to talk about is Thomas Malthus, and what's sometimes referred to as the Malthusian perspective. Malthus was this old Victorian guy a couple hundred years ago, and was trying to explain why there was famine in the world. And basically what he argued was this. He said that the human population has the ability to grow like this, right? As I mentioned, 2 people become 4, become 8, become 16, become 32, right? We can grow geometrically. But he argued food production only increases in a linear way. So in other words, if you were able to create 1 bushel of corn one year, maybe then 2 the next, then 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So that goes up at an arithmetic rate, whereas population goes up geometrically. So what he argued was eventually you're just going to get more people than you've got food. So there's a ton of Malthus for you. So what he argued was happen is this. He said, this bottom line here is the population, and this is the food production line. He'd say that you would, he'd say that you would have this population growth, but that you'd eventually hit this line where your population would start outstripping your food supply, and then that what would happen is that then your population would dip. And what they mean by this population dipping would be death, starvation, warfare, disease, famine, all these kinds of things would be what causes this. Then he says you might get a recovery, and it's going to go back up again, but then it's going to hit your food production line and it's going to happen again. And so one of the things he was arguing is that when you see things like fighting over resources, like warfare for resources, or famine and starvation, he kind of argued that this was a natural process, that as long as human populations were going to grow and have these high birth rates, you're going to have these moments of famine and death. And the other argument he makes is that if you help these people, if you give them food, if you stop this, you're just kicking the problem down the road because eventually it's going to happen again. And he thought that this was just this kind of consequence of the way populations and food production worked. And so he said the only reason, or the only way out of this, is what he referred to as moral restraint, which is Victorian English for basically not having sex. And so this kind of theory was that you just have to bring down the birth rate, right? And that if you bring down the birth rate, then you won't end up with these famines. But that, so then therefore the solution when you see famine and starvation, as he'd say, is have fewer kids, and that's why this is the problem. And this is still a fairly popular kind of perspective, but now it's called Neo-Malthusians because they don't say just like, quote, moral restraint in terms of not having sex. They also say, well, okay, it could be family planning and contraception and this sort of thing. And so because of that, but they still say that, you can you still have to manage the population by bringing down birth rate. He said otherwise you're just destined to keep having famine and starvation and death. So that's one perspective, Malthus's, or what's also referred to as Neo-Malthusians today. But there's two more perspectives I want to hit here. One is Cornucopian. Cornucopia, if you recall the term, is that idea that you have what they call the Horn of Plenty, which is when you see it like Thanksgiving decorations, that kind of stuff. And the phrase that probably best sums up the Cornucopian perspective is by a phrase by Mao Zedong when he said, "Every mouth comes with two hands." And basically what he meant here, just because I've got the clip art, I got to keep using the hat. Basically what his idea was is that yes, when somebody's born, they're consumers of resources. And that's what Malthus kind of saw people as. But Mao says no, and others, that yes, they're consuming resources, but they also have two hands and they're producing resources. Every person that's born is out in the fields. They are producing things. They're making machinery that's making things more efficient, etc. And there was a woman named Esther Bozerup who she did a research study to look at kind of which was true, kind of Malthus or this Cornucopian view. And the way she looked at it and did her research is she wanted to look at how many calories per person of food were being produced in the world, and how has that changed as our population has changed. Because according to Malthus, you should be getting, look at these years from like the 1960s, and then obviously this becomes speculative past 2015 here, so don't worry about this 2030 number. But if you get to where the data really exists here up to 2015, and let's just look at the world, this red line here, we know that the population has gone from about 3 billion to like 7 billion in this time period, so about twice as many people. But what she found is that we actually have more calories per person being produced than we did when we had half of the population was half its size. In other words, what she found was that Malthus was wrong in terms of the idea that food production increases on a linear way. That food production does actually increase for every person you add. You actually get more food per person. So in other words, it kind of backs up what Mao had said about this, that people are units of production more so than just merely units of consumption. And so this is important because the question then still comes in, well, okay, if we've got more food per person now with twice as many people, why is it that people are still starving? What is going on that is causing, famine and starvation and death? And this brings us to our third perspective. Oh, and one quick comment is to recall back to the idea of biopower that we talked about a couple modules ago, and this idea that people are producers, not just consumers of resources, right? They don't just consume, they make stuff, right? Okay, so now going to the third perspective, which is what's sometimes referred to as the Marxist or Neo-Marxist perspective. And basically what they argue is that the argument here with the Neo-Marxist perspective is that they agree with the Cornucopians. They think that there is enough food on the planet for everybody, and the data backs this up. There is. So they say, well, then why are people starving? They say because the food is not being distributed evenly, right? Some people have access to a gazillion calories, and some people don't have access to any. So in other words, they say that when you see starvation and you see famine, this is not because there's too many people. It's not because people have had too many children. It's because the food that exists is not being divided up in a more equal way. And so in other words, they'd argue this is an economic problem or a political problem more than just a natural problem of too many people. So Karl Marx and one of his compatriots, Friedrich Engels, blamed poverty and starvation basically on capitalism and social inequality. And not just capitalism, they also would have also blamed the slavery, which was still kind of going on in some quarters in their time period as well. So they'd say, are starvation, warfare, and disease more the result of maldistribution than overpopulation? They would say yes. And so critics of Malthus and his modern-day followers point out that though the global population has doubled 3 times since Malthus wrote his essay, food supplies have doubled 5 times. In other words, Malthus was wrong that food production is a linear process. Right? So, but here's the question. Yes, we can agree with, they say, the Marxists and the Cornucopians about the idea that, yes, we're producing more, and we can agree that, yes, there's definitely inequality, and that's why some people are suffering from famine and starvation. But Malthus still must have some kind of point, right, in that there must be some limit, you would think, to what human population the Earth could support. So, for instance, yes, we're producing more and more food per person, but so that means that we can have 7 billion people. But what about 8 billion? Can we have 50 billion? Can we have 100 billion? Can we have 900 billion people? You'd think at some point there's a limit. And this brings us to the last point here on population, which is referred to as the global human appropriation of net primary productivity. It is a mouthful of a term there. So they have the nice handy thing here, HANPP, which doesn't really help, but anyway, that's the acronym. This is a very important concept, and basically what it is this is what percentage of all photosynthesis going on the planet is going to humans. And right now it's estimated that between 20 to 40% of all terrestrial production, meaning all the photosynthesis going on the surface of the Earth, not the oceans, but just the land masses, is going in here, right, into humans. And that's why we've been able to increase our population so much, is that we're basically taking a larger and larger share of all of the production of the Earth, and we're eating it. So that's why we've been able to increase our food production even more than our population. But there is a limit out there. We just haven't necessarily reached it yet. And the question is that the question is not so much when do we hit 100% of all terrestrial production goes to humans. The question that probably is more important is what happens as we start getting towards 50, 60, 70% here. What are the ecological consequences in terms of how, when one species on the planet is using so much of the resources, does that start tearing apart some of the ecological webs of which kind of the larger ecosystems depend, including ourselves? Like, what sort of consequences are we going to get because of the mass extinctions that are going to start happening, or that are happening, because of the heavy use of habitat that is now going directly to human consumption and agriculture. So this term here is important because it shows you that there is this limit where if we get beyond that or if we, that there's some limit or some problem kind of lurking out there that yes, we might be able to keep producing and farming and all this, but it's coming from somewhere, and at the moment where it's coming from is from other species on the planet. And so, when we get back into this concept of, how this informs like apocalyptic visions, the idea of kind of apocalypse by overpopulation has been fairly common in terms of literature and also in movies. Movies such as Soylent Green, Wall-E, Logan's Run, Blade Runner, a lot of these have this idea of sort of this massively overpopulated Earth that kind of brings about kind of our own destruction. Soylent Green is kind of one of the more fun movies that was, I think it was 60s or maybe early 70s, I think early 70s, that, not to give away spoiler here, but sorry, I just did. There's Soylent Green is this particular new food that everyone on the planet's basically living off of, and at this point the only thing that there is for food is other people, and so they're just grinding up people and turning them into Soylent Green and feeding it to everybody else. But that's kind of this idea that's sort of the end of humanity. All right, so one of the videos we have for this module here is the video I referred to about the quake in Port-au-Prince. So make sure that you're looking at that too, and thinking about it in terms of that context of like spaces of vulnerability and the idea that it's not just a natural hazard, it's kind of a hazard connected to the way in which humans are living in a particular place that kind of makes things really big disasters. And that's something we'll come back to as we look at other types of disaster, catastrophe, and apocalypse throughout the class. So that's it for this module. All right, I'll see you next time.